Welcome to a tutorial video on learning JavaScript. In this video, I'm going to talk about the ES6 Functionality Classes. In previous versions of JavaScript, when we talked about object-oriented programming that used objects, JavaScript wasn't quite object-oriented. It had functionality that could mimic a lot of it, and with additional libraries or frameworks, it could come very, very close to being object-oriented programming models. But they weren't quite objects. They were still used the prototype chain for inheritance and other various techniques depending on the library or framework also used. And so with ES6 and the introduction of the class keyword, JavaScript moves very, very close to being object-oriented, and in fact basically is object-oriented in the ways that particularly matter, in that we have classes and we have the ability to do inheritance. Inheritance won't be really covered in this video, but I'm just going to talk about classes, how to create them, and how to use them. So we notice right here on line 2, I have the new keyword class. Previously, in other versions of JavaScript, when we wanted to define an object, we would define basically a function, and we would define its structure, and then we could use the new keyword to create a copy of that function, knowing that functions are basically objects. And this was sort of a complicated way to get around the fact that it didn't have classes or objects exactly, but it had functions that would act like objects that we could then create new instances of. All of that was kind of confusing, and so with ES6, it introduced the new keyword class. This allows us to define an object and then use instances of that definition of that object, which is a great deal more cleaner and allows us to express things in a different way. Along with that functionality also comes additional functionality I'm also going to talk about in this video. But the very first thing, as I noted here, is the new class keyword. And notice the class extends right here to down here, and it looks very similar to how classes are used, almost this exact syntax, in other programming languages. So it brings JavaScript in line with a very common way of writing classes and creating object definitions. So we see the initial class keyword, the name of the class, which will be the name of the object, opening and closing curly brackets, and that defines everything within there. Now I mentioned that additional functionality was added along with the keyword class. One of those is the use of the constructor keyword. Previously, when we were creating functions that were objects, we could mimic the use of a constructor by creating a function within an object of a similar name that would act as a kind of constructor and allow us to do things that were constructor-like. Again, because of that confusing syntax and people not quite getting it and it not quite being designed for that either, the constructor keyword now helps us make that very clear. This is a constructor function. That is, when we create this object, we are calling this function. And so we see right here the constructor keyword. When we're creating this new object of square, this will be the very first function being called. And so we see here, also I'm using default parameter values. X equals 10, Y equals 10. So if we don't pass any values into this object when we create it via this constructor function, it will have its default values. Within this function, this constructor, we notice we're declaring two locally scoped properties of this object. Notice I'm using the this keyword and the dot notation. This was very common in other versions of JavaScript when we wanted to find properties of the object that was a function, and so we go about doing it using the same way. Notice I'm using underscores here for defining this. This is going to be important and a little bit later in this video, but I want to point it out right here. So we have default parameter values. If no other values are supplied, these will be the defaults, and these are the default values for the parameters within this object. So we have an object square. So far in this code, we have an object square. When we create it, the default values of X will be 10 and Y will be 10. And these will be immediately passed into the properties of underscore X, which will be set to X, and underscore Y, which will be set to Y. And so we notice when we immediately create this new object, it immediately has properties that were passed in as part of the default parameter values, all part of ES6. Now, the additional functionality that was also part of ES ES6 is not only do we have constructors, but we have getters and setters, which are part of more advanced functionality found in other programming languages that are much more object-oriented. And you find them, for example, in Java or C#. And so we can actually start to use that same syntax creation within JavaScript now. And so using get and set keywords, we can define the functionality to use with certain properties. So when a certain property is accessed, we can define what happens if the value is get, that is if someone requests the value, or if someone attempts to change the value, what happens. So get and set allows us that functionality when dealing with those properties. However, there's a caveat, or sort of a catch to them. When we define get and set keywords in this way for properties of an object within its class, we are in fact overriding the default of those properties. So we can't define, for example, 5 and 6 to make these this dot x and this dot y, because down here, when we use these gets and sets, it would override those properties and it would really confuse JavaScript and it would throw an error because it wasn't sure what to make of that. So we need to make sure then, if we're using getters and setters, using the get and set keyword to define what happens to our properties, we need to make sure we don't conflict with any existing property names. Just a common caveat to be aware of. So that's why I use these underscores on line 5 and line 6. This dot underscore x and this dot underscore y, establishing those as semi-private, not technically private, but semi-private or just obscured properties of this object. And then we define the public interface, we use the get and set keywords. So finally, let's talk about those. So moving down here on line 9, we see I'm using the word get, then the name of this function, and then what should happen. Well, if you get, that is, ask for the property of x, what should happen is it should return this dot underscore x. Very common interface found in a lot of other programming languages. What should happen when you ask for the value of the property y? Well, it should return this dot underscore y. Very, very straightforward. Now, what happens if we want to define new properties? Well, we can start to do that right here. Notice I didn't define volume within the constructor, but we can define it as a property using the get and set keywords. And that's what I've done on line 11. I've said if you ask for the property volume that's part of this object, it will return this dot underscore x multiplied by this dot underscore y, which is the volume of a square. So we can see we can start to define new properties using these get and set keywords, and then what happens when you ask for the data get or attempt to change its value set. And in fact, that's what I've done for x and y right here. If we attempt to change those values, whatever's passed in this case a, becomes this dot underscore x is equal to a, and so it just changes those values each time. So using the get and set keywords allows us a greater flexibility when defining how the different properties of an object are dealt with, if we're changing them or if something else happens. In fact, we could set stuff in here so these values could not be changed by defining what happens when you ask for that property. For example, notice volume doesn't have a set. You can't change volume. You can ask for it, get that value, but you can't change it. So it allows us a greater flexibility when defining how we want to change things, what should happen, what calculations should happen, and it's very useful and very simple shorthand syntax for doing that. Now let's look at these last few lines down here. On line 18, you see a very common thing when we use objects across all of JavaScript, including previous versions. Right here, we're saying let. This is the new ES6 for a mutable or a variable that might change. We see example square as its name, and it's equal to a new square. So we're creating a new instance of an object. What is the object? The object is square, and it is defined right here, lines 2 through 16, using the class keyword. This defines the object, and then we can create a new instance of it. Notice on line 18, we're not sending anything into this. So it's creating a new square. The new square, this whole phrase right here, expression, is calling the constructor right here on line 4. It's setting these default values right here because of the default parameter list. So underscore x is becoming 10, underscore y is becoming 10. And so we see right here, line 18, we're creating a new object based on the definition of square with the initial values of 10, 10 because we didn't send anything to the constructor. Immediately under that, on line 19, we're changing the property x. When we do that, right here, we're using line 13. So we're using the set keyword right here, and we're sending a new value in, which changes the internal value of underscore x. So then, down here on line 20, we're then asking for the volume. Volume, as I mentioned, is a property we added to this by using the get keyword right here on line 11. So I mentioned before, we can add new properties through this method. We don't necessarily have to use the this keyword. We can add them through using the get and set keywords instead. So down here, I'm saying, hey, what's the volume? And so this is a get right here on line 11. We're not changing anything. We're just getting the value. And when I run this, we see it's 120, which makes sense because it's 10 multiplied by 12, which is what we expected to see. So in this video, I've talked about classes as part of JavaScript ES6. And I mentioned that we define a class using the class keyword. And its syntax looks now very similar to other programming languages that follow this exact same model. I also mentioned that additional functionality was added along with the class keyword in JavaScript ES6. This was the use of the keyword constructor. I mentioned in previous versions we could sort of mimic the idea of a constructor, but now it's become a very specific keyword we use when we want a constructor for an object. And it's the constructor keyword. And we define that function. This is the very first function that's called when an object is created using whatever we've defined. So if we want initial stuff to happen right when we're constructing that object, this helps us do that. I also mentioned that the get and set keywords can be used to define the properties and how they're accessed. For example, if we want to get a value, we can define the get keyword, the name of that property, and what we want to happen, along with the set keyword in this very similar way. And we can in fact invent new properties, as I did right here on line 11, by saying get volume, adding new properties to this object that weren't already defined, and then defining what should happen. It should return these values right here, this multiplication of underscore x and underscore y. So this allows us some flexibility when dealing with new properties, using the get and set keywords, and in total, looking very similar to other programming languages and helping bring JavaScript ES6 much more in line with object-oriented programming models, expectations, and standards when writing code. Thanks for watching.